Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to today's stream of Lovecraftian Video Games, where I play a whole lot of video games as part of my thesis research. Frickin' great if you ask me. Anyway, this game is streaming to Facebook and Twitch, but I generally can't see any chatter that happens over on Facebook, so if you want to talk to me directly, please pop on over to Twitch. Otherwise, just sit back, watch and enjoy. So, for anybody who's wondering, the opening music this time was Rena, Reaper Queen by Falcon Shield. Sorry, it was Reaper Queen by Falcon Shield featuring Rena. Brain. I know what I'm talking about sometimes. Anyway, all music is played with permission. And as always, I can't promise if this will be a short stream or a long stream, as I do spontaneously pass out sometimes. Please do see the disclaimer. On that note, today has been a weirdly productive day. On the one hand, I haven't done a lot, but everything that I've wanted to do today, I've actually managed to do, so it's been good so far. And I've managed to keep to my general bad schedule, which is rare. So, that's good. Anyway, all of that aside, all the disclaimers done and dusted, today we are going to start with something special. We are going to be doing some gaming in a bit, but first, I'm going to share with you something that I haven't actually shared before, and that is the criteria for the Lovecraftian horror pyramid. So, what I'm talking about here is I am going to be sharing the criteria and the definition of Lovecraftian horror that I am using in order to determine where games end up in this diagram. So, if you're new and you haven't seen this before, the shorthand is this is the kind of the center point of my thesis. This is the tool I'm using as an analytical tool to present data. And that the data I'm getting is essentially what games that we often consider to be Lovecraftian or that are actively advertised as Lovecraftian, how Lovecraftian are they really? And once I've got that data, I'm going to be analyzing it further. But the first thing is getting the data and seeing how it measured up. And over here, you can see a whole lot of the games we've done so far. You'll notice quite a few of them are on the left here, on the side of Lovecraftian aesthetic. So I've got Lovecraftian aesthetic, Lovecraftian horror, and a section for both. And so games that have more aesthetic than horror lean further and further to the left. Games that have more horror than aesthetic lean to the right. Games that are actually have a good mix of both are much more central, and the less points you have overall, the lower you are. So there's quite a few games, several of which have been called Lovecraftian, or that reviewers, particularly Steam reviewers, have referred to the game as Lovecraftian, or have been recommended specifically on the basis of being Lovecraftian. A lot of them have ended up down here. And we've ended up with a couple of interesting ones that have managed to end up much higher up according to the criteria. And I'll talk about this a bit later, but a few of them are things like PT, which is currently the only thing we have on the horror side that is more horror than aesthetic. And we also have things like Dagon, which of course, Dagon is actually a Lovecraftian story, and it's essentially been turned into a visual novel, a very mildly interactive reading of the original story. It is currently in first place, but you'll also notice that The Terrible Old Man is much lower down, and The Terrible Old Man is essentially the same concept. There are reasons for that, which come to the criteria, which is what we are going to be talking about today. So, I've held off sharing the criteria before now for a couple of reasons. One of those was quite simply because I wanted feedback from my supervisors. I wanted them to have a look at it and tell me, hey, do you agree with this? Do you think that there should be more points to the definition, less points? Do you absolutely contest this and say, no, that is not how this works? And while there's still room for them to turn around and say, actually, I now think this, so far, they've read what I've written, and they agree with it. So it's now on much more of a solid footing. And the other reason is because I made a survey which was intended in part to get me more insight in what people other than me and people other than the academics thought about the term Lovecraftian, both just generally and in practice. Just seeing, hey, they may say they think Lovecraftian is this, but where do they actually place these games? What games do they think are Lovecraftian? So on and so forth. And thanks to the survey, I've now gotten some insight into that. So thank you to everyone who has participated in the survey. Uh, as always, please do remember we do have a survey and I'd love your input. But we now actually have a decent amount of that to start working with. So, with all of those things covered, I now feel confident to go, hey, this is what I'm working with. See how this fits with your mental thoughts. So, let's jump over to the criteria. So, this is it. It's not all too fancy, but there's 10 points for aesthetic and 9 points for content. Now, I'll go through each of these just quickly, because of course we want to get into games. Hello, Cassie Cat. Helpful as completely ignorant. Wow, irrelevant bystander. That was a great misreading of what you wrote there. As a completely ignorant bystander, what makes Lovecraftian and not... Yeah, I have not read his stuff. Yeah, so the term Lovecraftian is often used to cover a lot of things that academics either don't consider Lovecraftian or they do, but it's with a lot of quotation marks. And it's often used by people for marketing purposes just wildly because, hey, it works. It pulls in an audience, even if that's not actually the audience you're looking for. But if they buy it, it works. So you get people using the term for that sort of a purpose. Now, I'm not going to criticize that. I'm currently reading an interesting book on the concept of adaptation, which includes marketing as a form of adaptation. And so I'm reading that to give myself some more grasp and understanding. But let's go straight to the criteria here rather than meandering off onto a tangent. So I've divided the pyramid into two streams, which is the side of aesthetic and the side of horror. Now, normally when people think of aesthetic, they think of visuals, but it means much more than that. And I am using it in a little bit more of a presentation sense. And in another sense, I'm covering everything that isn't specifically horror. So this is going to include elements of visuals, created visuals, for example, like mental images. It's going to include things like style. It's going to include certain elements of structure. But it's also going to include themes, and I'll be talking a bit more about themes as we go through. So let's actually get started. So the first thing is the writing, the game, the product contains a richness of detail that is both precise and overwhelming. So a good example of this is Lovecraft often uses actually very, very specific numbers. Like, he uses words that you just sound like, yeah, that's a gazillion. It's like, it just seems like a randomly huge... No, it's actually a real number. It's like saying Google or Googleplex and intentionally meaning it to be that number and not just a word. So it's hard to picture that sort of thing in mind, and so it's both precise and overwhelming. You can't picture it, you can't easily imagine. It's the whole argument of trying to conceive of infinity. The story itself retells the same story again and again, each time adding more detail. Lovecraft often uses flashbacks for this methodology, but he also uses, hey look, I just read this note that told me a little bit of the story, and a bit later I read this longer note that told me the same story again, but with more details, and later on I get this other note that tells me the same story again in more details. There's a bunch of ways that he does that, but it's that same basic concept. Continuing on with aesthetic, a strong sense of realism except for the element of horror. It's a really important point because Lovecraftian horror is not realistic. It is are usually tied somehow to the supernatural, or the supernatural is the medium through which a horror is presented. Um, but everything else about the story is intentionally realistic. So you generally won't get, like, the horror is not, it's a monster, it's, there is a monster and it represents something. The horror isn't the monster itself, it's something beyond, but there's usually something like a monster as a medium. So, strong sense of realism, except for the element of horror, which is usually some sort of fantasy. Uh, Contains multiple narratives with their own natural climax. This is a very weird structural thing. I'm going to be trying to keep all of these things short because, I mean, I've written a thesis about it, so all of these points are discussed in much more detail. But a lot of Lovecraftian horror, and a lot of Lovecraftian writing, including his non-horror stuff, he usually has at least two narratives that are kind of intertwined, and the big shocking climax does not happen at the end of the book or the end of the story, and the actual climax of the story doesn't look or feel like a Hollywood style climax. So it's not like, it's a natural ending, not an artificial ending, and that ending may just be leaving it on a question or leaving it on an element of horror. It feels incomplete, and that's part of the how he's getting the horror across, because it's not tied up in a neat little bow. But it will still have a climax, a boiling point, a moment when the horror is revealed, and there's going to be one for each narrative that he's got. Um, the next one is going to be interesting. So this is it focuses on themes of psychic possession, degeneration, both in social and evolutionary terms, the superiority of alien intelligence, forbidden knowledge, cosmicism, and resilience that is offered by traditional values. Now, you may be asking, why do I have the themes in the aesthetic and not in the horror? And the reason is, these are not the source of horror in Lovecraft's writing. Psychic possession or degeneration, they may be terrifying, but you are supposed to be horrified by what it represents. So, using forbidden knowledge as a good example, he uses forbidden knowledge a lot, but forbidden knowledge doesn't have to be a theme that is in horror. It can be a theme that is across a lot of other genres. But this forbidden knowledge isn't what you're supposed to be afraid of. It is what you are supposed to be afraid of, and we'll get to it much more down here, is things like the appalling truth. It's not just that this knowledge is forbidden, it's why it's forbidden. It is appalling and horrifying, and usually has racial undertones or overtones in some sense. But there's other things other than racism that he does deal with, but it comes up a lot there. But that is the horror, this is the theme. And so that is why the themes have come under the aesthetic and aren't under the horror. There is a difference between them in Lovecraft's writings. The next one is actually a really important one. The reader and the protagonist are always one or more steps removed from the horror and are unable to interact with it directly. This is usually because it occurred in the past, or because the protagonist, whoever is telling the story in that moment, is observing the horror from a distance. There is very, very, very little direct interaction with the horror in Lovecraft stories. Some of that's because it's conceptual, and others is because it's so far separated, either in time or in space or something like that. You just can't interact with it. And this is one of the reasons that Lovecraftian horror actually works so well as a written medium and doesn't translate so well to film or to video games. Video games, obviously, you interact with the horror, but with the written medium, the way that the protagonist engages with the horror is they read reports, they interview people and hear stories, and before they come to actually going and entering wherever the horror is and actually engaging with the horror, they go, "No, I'm out," and leave and run away or something of the sort. Which means that our experience, while it's not the same, like, we don't have quite the same level as the protagonist doesn't have the same level as the people he's spoken to or the reports that he's reading, which means he's one step removed in a similar way to how we, the readers, are removed from the horror, and yet it's still horrifying. And that is part of the meta for how Lovecraftian horror in itself is quite different, and that comes from the structure. Anyway, the next one is the one that everybody is going to see, and quite a lot of games tick this box. Tentacles, mouths, scales, eyes, and body parts that are the wrong size or in the wrong places. Fur, tail, trunks, hooves. There's usually an aquatic theme to all of these things, but it's not necessary. There are plenty of examples of Lovecraftian creatures that don't have... they may have an aquatic theme to them, but it's not the dominant thing. But Lovecraft, more often than not, uses aquatic descriptors. The next one is, it's something exceedingly difficult to describe to others without sounding crazy, such as a mountain that walks, or a combination of heavily contradictory features, or coming back to a richness of detail that's both precise and overwhelming. That often comes up here. He pours in so many adjectives that you have no idea how to conceive of it, because he's just said that, and at their hips they have tentacles, mouths, scales, eyes, and body parts the wrong size or in the wrong places, fur, tail, trunks, and hooves. And that's just the creature's hips. He does that sort of thing to make it impossible to actually imagine what is being said. So that is what that is essentially about. That is the so many adjectives section. Uses specific terms coined by Lovecraft with the intent to be read as connected to those other Lovecraftian tales. Now, this is a really interesting one, because Lovecraft only ever intended his lore, and I give that in quotation marks, to be at best a backdrop and not a canonical mythos. For all intents and purposes, he treated his own language, like the things he invented, he treated them as cameo references. They're just in the backdrop, it doesn't matter. Necronomicon, yeah, that's just a word, and I've used it once before, but I'm going to use it here again. It's a reference. Fantastic. And that's it. He didn't really conceive of a huge mythos, which is also why you see his stuff appearing in Conan the Barbarian, and stuff from Conan the Barbarian appearing in Lovecraft's works. It's just using these terms wherever, as a way to just flesh things out, but he didn't really have a world in mind. He didn't have a cosmology in mind. All of that comes later, and I will talk a little bit about that before we start gaming. The next one is that the protagonist should be a blank slate character with minimal personality of their own. Now, there's a lot about this, so it's the trope of the everyday man, the blank slate character, and what the trope of the everyday man was in Lovecraft's time is not quite the same as it is today. It's, for Lovecraft, it is typically a white, well-respected, educated member of the community. They're not necessarily the social elite, but they're definitely going to be sort of upper middle class, and also people who prioritize the arts in some respect, but are familiar with the sciences and believe in materialism and a bunch of things like that. As a rule, they're not religious, as an example. So what Lovecraft considers the blank slate everyman character is essentially himself, which, can you scoot this fabulous chart to the left slightly? I can't really, hang on. Does that work? No. There we go. Sorry about that. Thank you for picking up on that, Cassie. So, the last point of the aesthetic is that it's a blank slate character with minimal personality of their own. That minimal personality is essentially Lovecraft using himself and sometimes some of his friends as more or less stand-in characters, but trying to limit emotion, trying to remove as much personality as possible. So strong personalities as a protagonist or means it's not Lovecraftian because it is supposed to be that, like it is supposed to be that trope. You'll notice from what I've just said about aesthetics across the board that some of these things you'll find in just any novel, any horror, like contains multiple narratives with their own natural climax. Aside from the fact that for Lovecraft the climaxes are separate, they're not all, everything is wrapped together in one moment, that everything comes to a head at the same time. He doesn't tend to do that. But aside from that, you could apply this to a lot of other stories, and that is really worth pointing out, because that is part of why some of these games have gotten quite a few points, because some of these points are actually quite easy to get just from just from being a story, essentially, whereas others are much harder to get. So that's the aesthetics. That is the presentation, that is the structure, all those sorts of things. Now we're going to have a look at the horror, which is what everybody associates with Lovecraft, but they also often just think about it in terms of tentacles. It's a interesting thing that I found when going into it. So the first thing is the horror is the belittling of humanity. Humanity is specks of dust compared to the horror. Now this is an interesting one because this is one of the things that separates modern Cthulhu mythos from Lovecraft. Now, I've got a little bit down here where I talk about Derleth and the Cthulhu mythos, but it's worth noting that Lovecraftian horror is not the same as the Cthulhu mythos. The Cthulhu mythos, for the most part, was invented after Lovecraft died. So it's derivative. It's inspired by. This doesn't mean it's worse. I often actually think the Cthulhu mythos is better, and it's definitely better for video games, in my opinion. But one of the differences between Cthulhu mythos and Lovecraftian horror is actually in this first one. The concept of belittling humanity. Humanity is so small, it's infinitesimally small, barely noticeable, if noticeable. It honestly doesn't even matter on a cosmic scale. Yes, that is exactly what it is. But it's also, you are looking down at humanity. It is belittling humanity. It's not, we are putting humans, like you've got ants, and then cows, and then humans, and then eldritch abominations. No, it's, yeah, ants, cows, humans, they're all exactly, like, they're basically atomic specks. All of them. Like, all of your, what achievements? That is it is belittling. And that is where the horror comes from. It's not just that we are small compared to, it's that we are reduced compared to. So that's a big one that separates later stories from Lovecraft. The next one is indescribable. The horror must be unseen or indescribable even if seen. This, of course, ties in directly to the tentacle stuff and being exceedingly difficult to describe, but it's supposed to be a source of horror as well. So that's why it kind of comes up 3 times in a sense, but it is the difference is important. The next one is that it's unknowable, and this is really important. Lovecraft is very famous for his quote about the oldest horror is the horror of the unknown, but that's not just it. The horror must be unknown and unknowable. No amount of engagement will permit comprehension, and whatever we learn, very much in quotation marks, reveals very, very little. And this is another point that separates later stories from Lovecraft, because August Derleth and a lot of the later writers, they make the unknown known. They insert Christian morality onto the stories. They add rivalries, relationships, competitions. Various entities are now associated with one of the 4 elements of, earth, fire, water, and air. And so all of these sorts of things give us new knowledge, and we can, you can open a Wikipedia article and it doesn't just say, Cthulhu, we don't know, here are some indecipherable text. No, there is a huge amount of stuff on Cthulhu because we know a lot now. And that's not Lovecraftian. It Lovecraftian horror is both unknown and unknowable. So that's another turning point. I'll try and speed through the rest of these. Helpless, the protagonist must not it through traditional values. Yeah, I'll have to talk about that a little bit. But there is no healing or returning to the status quo. The Lovecraftian horror permanently scars, permanently changes. And yeah, you can engage in traditional values, but it's barely even a band-aid. The wound is still there, it is not healing, you've just got a band-aid covering it, is essentially what the traditional values are. The best solution is not to get wounded in the first place. So that is helpless. Now, the concept of traditional values, I've mentioned it before. One of the themes is resilience offered by traditional values, and that ties in here as well. What Lovecraft considers traditional values is an essay unto itself. I'm not going to get into that. Not right now anyway, but it is kind of important that it's traditional values. It's not simply, I go get drunk, or I go and practice science. No, it's much more than that, and it's not treated as a video game mechanic, essentially. Um, traditional values include. I'm not going to go into it, but yeah. Anyway, hopeless. There is no hope. There is no victory. There is no good ending. The only option is to survive, get away, or to engage in self-denial. So this comes back to the helpless sort of factor. It's like it is helpless and hopeless. Those two are very, very intertwined. They're two slightly different types of horror, but they build up on each other. And this is actually a big thing about Lovecraftian horror, because the thing is that Lovecraftian horror is sometimes it is very similar to Lord Dunsany, who I am not convinced I'm pronouncing his name right. It is fairly similar to Marken. Some of it is similar to Edgar Allan Poe, mostly his early stuff, not his later stuff. One of the big differences is that so Marken is a great example. Marken's cosmic horror is hopeful. There is still hope, even if it is blind, it is faith, it is the sort of thing that a reasonable person would deny, but you just power on with belief. Lovecraftian horror is that not just that it is ineffectual, you can't even engage with it. That, if you do, is just self-denial. And that, the helpless and hopeless, is a very important part of what defines Lovecraftian horror. The next one is Appalling Truths. Did talk about that a little bit, which is the horror is the verifiable truth, which is also usually overwhelming, incomprehensible, and impossible to communicate without sounding insane. Sort of like reading this list out and trying to get it in a short space of time. Logic of insanity. Now, this is a big one. I brought this one up a lot. Hello, Zoranax. So I actually bring this one up a lot in my treatment of video games, because being insane is not just about becoming a babbling fool or flipping morality on a dime. There is a logic behind it that usually comes from accepting the premise of what the appalling truth is. And this is really important because a lot of later stories, like a lot of later authors, and especially a lot of video games, the Call of Cthulhu RPG is very responsible for this as well. A lot of them treat madness as pancakes, and just make it gibbering, just gibbering nonsense. It makes no sense. There might be the occasional word that's actually important, but every other word is not, if there are words at all. And this is actually really, it's really bad. In a modern day context, we would consider this ableism. We would fundamentally consider this a very, very negative stereotype of how disability is depicted. It's demeaning to people who have PTSD. It's demeaning to, it's treating people who have suffered trauma as if it's just nonsense and they should get over it or something like that. Or, you know, oh, you've just gone insane. Here, have some alcohol, have a drink, and now you're sane again. That is not Lovecraft. That is later authors. Lovecraft, there is logic behind it. He actually treats trauma as like it's the premise. Um, and you can do a reading of a lot of what Lovecraft writes as trauma responses. Now, I am not. There are problems with discussing that because then you start getting into how do we justify racism? It's totally a trauma response. That is totally an argument that I've seen in some of Lovecraft's writings, like some of his letters, some of the things I've been reading. I'm like, this is looking like you're heading in that direction. I personally think he 100% was in that area, but I haven't found a direct confirmation of that yet. But other writers, other people from the time period and so on and so forth, certainly could, and in at least one instance that I'm aware of, did take that sort of thing as justification. You know, it's that sort of thing of, oh yes, we're not really racist or we're not really bigoted or whatever. It's a trauma response. Um, that is a conversation I don't really want to get into, but I think it's very important to raise because whenever you hear people talk about Lovecraft being racist, he absolutely is. He really, really is. I wouldn't necessarily go as far to say he is racist abnormal to his time. Some of the things that he says are like, yeah, no, this is actually kind of normal, and this is part of how, you know, a lot of horrific acts were justified in the time period. But also, it's really important to realize that the type of racism that Lovecraft puts forward is not the same as modern racism. Um, and so people will say, oh yeah, Lovecraft was racist, and then not realize that he is either more racist than they realize, or that they have accidentally taken on board some of his racist concepts because they didn't realize that those were parts of the racism. Now, Lovecraftian racism is a thesis unto itself. It's only really started to be getting properly recognized in academia since about 2016. Like, there have been one or two tiny things before then, but it's actually started to be a thing in Lovecraftian academia over the last 5-6 years. But there's a lot there, and just saying Lovecraft was racist isn't enough. Because how he was racist is not the same as how we are today. And I bring it up here because it ties back into the logic of insanity. Lovecraft's concept of insanity is rooted in, if you accept this basic premise, the insanity follows. And if you follow that logic, which is a way to do things, it can lead to appalling truths in a modern context. So it's a thing that writers of Lovecraft actually grapple with, and a lot of modern writers and the Cthulhu mythos itself often subverts. A lot of modern Cthulhu mythos writers actively subvert the racist tropes of Lovecraft, and they find things that, oh yeah, most people don't realize that's racist. I'm gonna write a story that interprets that in a non-racist way, which is one of the reasons why the Cthulhu mythos, it can't be completely separated from Lovecraft, but it is moving. The Cthulhu mythos is an evolving medium, and it changes with the times. Whereas Lovecraft, given that he's dead, does not. His horror is static, and we have moved past some of those concepts. So, yeah, so the next one ties directly into that. Part of the horror should be fueled by real-world stereotypes that are already held by the audience to help build the horror and suspense. This is typically racism, but it is not necessarily so. All of that ties back into what I just said. But Lovecraft uses stereotypes a lot. And not just racist stereotypes, he uses other stereotypes as well. But he uses them as a way to build up tension. And this is where you run into a thing where a lot of people read Lovecraft today and they're just like, that wasn't very horrifying. How was this horrifying? And that's actually because we don't hold many of those stereotypes anymore. A lot of the racism isn't there anymore. If an Italian is in the book, if you're reading and it's just like, and the Italian is speaking, you are supposed to be building tension because Italians were not considered white people. Same with the Irish. Irish were not considered white people. They weren't considered trustworthy. They were all considered deceitful, criminals, scum of the earth, that sort of thing. And Lovecraft doesn't spell it out because he just assumes that the audience is reading it with that in mind, which means that there is tension, horror type tension that Lovecraft is writing into his works that we in the modern day don't necessarily even notice is there because we go, oh cool, it's in Italian, keep reading, what's the Italian saying? And the reverse is true. If a Scandinavian person is talking, they are the most trustworthy soul on earth, and you can trust them over literally anyone else because they are the whitest of the white. Which, you know, some people have had fun recontextualizing that in modern concepts of, you know, communist Scandinavia, socialist Scandinavia versus, you know, traditional values, which is really funny when you try and think about that and how that has kind of flipped. But the point is that the Cthulhu mythos culture itself evolves over time, and Lovecraft, as some of you may be aware of, he wasn't just you know, a product of his time. He was a product of 100 years earlier because he actively wanted to maintain values of 100 years before. There's a lot to talk about in that, but one of the things he prides himself on is the fact that in his vocabulary he has erased any word that was invented within the last 100 years. So he spoke in an archaic format when he wrote his writing, which seems kind of archaic to us. It seemed archaic to the people reading it too, because he was deliberately writing in a style that was 100 years out of date. That's not an element of the horror, that's kind of an element of the aesthetic. But the next one is, the only salvation may be found in the resilience offered by traditional values, but it only delays the inevitable. It doesn't offer an escape. Again, we've covered that on a few points. Now, I've got some other notes down here, which I've kind of brought up already, which is that Lovecraft never intended his lore to be a mythos or any form of canon, and that there are differences between what August Derleth turned the stories into and the Cthulhu mythos that came from that. One of these things is that I didn't really talk about is in later stories you can combat the horror, and nukes are a thing. Technology is now a way to actually fight. It becomes a viable option. And we've seen that in a couple of the games where technology is lifting humanity up to a level where we can compete, even if only a little. And that is very, very, very non-Lovecraftian. So this is what we're looking at here, and this gives you a little bit of an idea of, one, what the context is of the pyramid, and how and why all these things are appearing on here, but also why some games which you might have played and you might go, no, that's very much in the Cthulhu mythos. That doesn't make it Lovecraftian. Being in the Cthulhu mythos is not the same as being Lovecraftian, and it is an important distinction. So bringing it back to what we are doing today, because I'm going to be doing some gaming in a moment, the big problem I've been having is that I don't have much on the horror side of this spectrum. I've got quite a few things in the middle and quite a few things on the left, but I don't have anything on the horror side. And the reason for that is that if you go to Google and you type in the words Lovecraft, Necronomicon, Cthulhu, tentacles, that's all the aesthetic. All of those things are the aesthetics. The things that people notice first are the aesthetics. They don't necessarily, even if they feel the horror, it's hard to search for the horror. So it's hard to find games that are the horror, but not the aesthetic. And that is what we are going to be pursuing today. I've gotten, so these are the games that we've just done. These are the games that I have recently acquired, which none of these games are specifically advertised, although I may look into the reviews and they may get comments, but I found all of these games by looking for horror games, not by looking for Lovecraftian horror games. So this is the next part of the thesis. It is trying to find stuff to fit on this side. It is trying to find stuff that focuses on these things, but specifically does not focus on these things. So that's the challenge, and that's what I'm going to be working on today. I can see a few messages have been left, so I'm just going to read them out. Welcome to Lovecraft. Sad face, I'm enjoying the lecture. Thank you. I know you said you didn't want to go into traditional values, but for context, what are some examples of his version of traditional values? So abstinence is one, and I'm not so much talking abstinence as in sexual abstinence. I actually am having huge difficulty thinking of any time where that concept comes out, because that's like, that sort of abstinence is a religious theme more than it is a materialist theme. When I'm talking abstinence, I'm talking abstaining from drugs and alcohol. When a character engages in drugs and alcohol, they are practicing self-denial. They are practicing trying to forget. But they do so, and they usually call it out as, don't think of me terribly, or don't dismiss my tale because I am high on morphine, because I have become a morphine addict. The character acknowledges that they have gone outside of traditional values to try and deal with it, and that it hasn't worked, and that it doesn't work. A lot of the characters that engage in that, and when I say a lot, I mean I can't think of a single one that survives. There may be one or two that do, but to my knowledge, pretty much every alcoholic, everyone who suffers, who takes morphine, they die. Usually as a consequence of the horror, because it doesn't work. With the traditional values specifically, because having any form of cure kind of goes against the concept, what he usually seems to do is they try and resist, they try and just continue life, attending family events, engaging with social norms, going to polite fancy dinners, learning about the sciences and how the world works and how everything is rational, even if they know it's wrong. Engaging in those things brings some level of comfort, and comfort through those sort of traditional values, like, say, a Thanksgiving dinner. Those are the sorts of things that he kind of says, look, this helps, but it doesn't stop it. It's just a band-aid. And things like, that deviate from that ultimately make things worse. You might get temporary respite, but that respite is fleeting and makes things worse. So he has some views on that. What next? That is some spreadsheet. Yes, it is. We will be getting into gaming in a moment. I just as I said at the start, I have now reached a point where I can convey this with a certain amount of confidence, so I am. My version of traditional is: man is the head of the house, woman submit to your husband, Christ is in the home, children are seen, not heard. Yeah, Lovecraft actually only partially adheres to that. He very much does the whole man is the head of the house thing, but he justifies that on look, have you seen Django Unchained? If you've seen Django Unchained and you look at the character played by That actor who everyone said should win an Oscar and then one day won an Oscar. Um, I've forgotten his name. Titanic dude. How have I forgotten his name? Um, but yeah, the guy who brings out the skull and starts talking about craniology, Mr. Candy, yes. Thank you, thank you. If you look at Mr. Candy, that Leo DiCaprio, thank you. Um, Leo DiCaprio's character, Mr. Candy, um, everything he and his household represents, so long as you remove any specific religious references, that is very, very close to what Lovecraft is drawing upon. And when I say Lovecraft is drawing upon, I mean, like, that craniology science, that those textbooks were things that Lovecraft himself is known to have read when he was growing up. Like, when he was a kid. I think before he was age 10. I think, yeah, he had read some of those books on craniology, which by then had been rejected. Like, by the time Lovecraft was alive, people had gone, this is absolutely rubbish, and had thrown it out. But that is what Lovecraft read, and that is what he grew up on. So you can more or less equate it to conservative values, but it does change from there because he removes the religious elements and he puts some of it into materialism and so on and so forth, and science and that sort of thing. Anyway, I adore Mr. Candy. Yikes. Okay, makes sense. Yeah, that is a very rough way of putting it. I could go into much more detail, but I'm actually having difficulty isolating some of it myself because his views do change over time. For example, at one point he called himself a fascist, and then nearing the end of his life, he called himself a socialist fascist. He believed in both socialism and fascism, which is interesting and is like, that is an essay unto itself about what Lovecraft's beliefs were and how they changed over time and how those changes are represented in his writing. But the thing that stays the same, even if what he considers traditional values themselves, even if those change a little and tweak and develop over the decades that he was writing, the concept of traditional values stays. So that's the Lovecraftian horror pyramid. That was the criteria I have been using for it. These are all the games that we have assessed and the games that we have next to do. And I will, in a moment, I will actually stop this stream. That way it's a complete thing I can transfer over to YouTube. And then within a minute or two, I will come back and we will start playing After Hours. I am just basically going to go through... I'm going to go through these games essentially in alphabetical order. So these are... Unless somebody really wants to see me play a couple of these other games, like Stygian or Cultist Simulator, a couple of others, these are essentially the games we are going to be focusing on now. Before I jump into the game, I'm just going to show that we do have other games that I do need to get through. For example, Call of Cthulhu. I need to get through at least some of the Call of Cthulhu games at some point. Others like Cult of the Lamb is another one I need to get through at some point, as are Lovecraft's Untold Tales. But in order so that we can actually try and do something with this side of the pyramid, this is the hole I need to patch first. So, everybody who is currently here, I am going to be ending the stream in a moment, and in a minute or two, I will be starting it back up. I believe if you're watching on Twitch, if you just stick around, the stream will start up again. Like, you could just stay on the same screen. You wouldn't have to. I don't think you'll even have to refresh the page. If you're watching on Facebook, you will have to jump back onto my wall and go to the next link that appears. In the meantime, I hope that has been informative, enjoyable, interesting, useful, and if you don't think that is a thing, if you disagree with any part of the criteria, let me know. That's why the survey exists. I want to hear your criticism. I want to evolve and adapt my understanding, and that happens most when I've got feedback. So thank you very much, and I will see you all for games in about 2 minutes. See you then.